let's talk about the fiction that I've read in the last month, which is Soldier of the Mist by Gene Wolfe, Count Zero by William Gibson, and Lords and Ladies by Terry Pratchett. So these are all technically in series. Soldier of the Mist is the first of three, of two published in the 80s and one later, called the Latro series or similar, the Soldier series. This is the second in the Sprawl trilogy, comes after Neuromancer, which I've reviewed here. Neuromancer is very well known, and this is obviously part of Discworld, part of the Witches sub-series. So though it's only three, and there's other, I'm reading other fiction, got a buddy read, a Guy Gavriel Kay book, Lions of Arasan buddy reading. I'm reading the second Bastable book by Inez, but with my kids. I'm reading lots of poetry and Middle English, fiction and stuff, but they tend to be shorter works. So this is just completed books, and so there's only three. But what a big three! A very, very, very enjoyable three for the last month. So in order, what should we do in order? No, let's do it. Let's not quite do it that way. Let's do Lords and Ladies first. This is a reread, but I first read this, as with many Discworld books. I first and last read this. I've reread some Discworld, but not this one. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I don't know, something like that. For this one, I don't know necessarily when I read it, but it's not on my reading record, which runs back 17 years. And I first got into Discworld in about 97 or something. So I probably read this late 90s last, so 25 years maybe. And I probably enjoyed it less at the time than some other books. And I don't know why necessarily, some other Discworld books. But I really enjoyed the reread. It is the third Witches book, the fourth Witches book actually, the fourth Granny Weatherwax book, but the third that is about the three witches, i.e. Nanny Og, Granny Weatherwax and Margaret Garlick. And introduces a witch who will, the fourth witch in their coven who will come up later. And I mean, I'll read the blurb. The fairies are back, but this time they don't just want your teeth. Granny Weatherwax and her tiny coven are up against real elves. It's Midsummer's Night, no time for dreaming, with full supporting cast of dwarves, wizards, trolls, Morris dancers, and one orangutan, and lots of hey nonny nonny and blood all over the place. By the way, notice the kind of mannerist stylings of Josh Kirby on the front. I like getting the Kirby covers as much as I like the Paul Kidby covers actually as well, particularly. And yeah, I'm not sure if it's quite up to Weird Sisters and Witches Abroad, but it's very, very good. And I think it has a bunch of things going on. I think the idea of thinking about using fairy as a way to talk about other possibilities, other realities, also about folklore. It's maybe the first, it's probably not quite the first, but it's one of the first of his real folklore exploration books of this kind. Feet of Clay is an obvious other one. So is I don't know. It slipped my mind. I had another good one in my head, but he does several kind of. He always uses folklore. He always uses legend, but this is one which is kind of what is the real essence of the folklore. And I think this idea that elves are beautiful, but that wouldn't guarantee that they were nice. There's a danger there in fairy. And on the note of my Middle English reading, in Sir Orfeo, what is in Orpheus, the Legend of Orpheus, Pluto. Here becomes the king of Elfland, the king of Otherland. He's an elf. He's a fairy. He steals Sir Orfeo's wife, and Sir Orfeo has to go and rescue her. Same with the Rhyme of True Thomas. The idea that you talk to a lady in a green kirtle and she takes you to Elfland. This is the elfin legend that's coming up, and it's something, by the way, that you definitely get there in Tolkien. Tolkien is influenced by those legends, even though his elves are basically, generally speaking, good. He certainly is influenced by this idea of elves as powerful and dangerous. And look at the behaviour of Thranduil in The Hobbit, or look at Galadriel talking about taking the ring, and certainly look at Feanor. So yeah, he's doing that take, and it's aesthetically quite strong, and that's quite effective. There's also some, and he's always good at atmosphere, as Pratchett. And there's also Margaret getting married to the King of Lanka, the former fool. And there's the wizards coming up, including Mustrum Ridcully, who I think is Ridcully's first book, Reaperman, which I realise I should have read before this in my reread, but they're about the same time in the meta timeline. But Ridcully, the Arch-Chancellor, he's coming up with the librarian, the Bursar and Ponder Stivens, who might be introduced here. I'm not sure again if he's in Reaperman as well. But they're coming up. And that means that Mustrum Ridcully has come back to his homeland, where once upon a time he knew a young lady called Esme Weatherwax. And there's this coven of young witches who want to do stuff in a much more stylish way. And you start, it's the first time Granny, in her fourth book, Granny begins to think about mortality for various reasons, which is something, though Pratchett is still at this point himself a relatively young man. I suppose he is, I think he is, he's in his 50s at this point. But he's not old by any means. Let's say he might not even be his 50s; might be very late 40s. But yeah, you can see it in his 40s. But you can see that there's this kind of beginning to mull over adulthood, and that kind of mortality vibe you start to get as things around you change and you see mutability. And so it's all going on, and it's funny, and it's got some very good scenes. It's got some moments of heroism and daring do, and again, he's very good at that. It's comedy, but it's good at that. It's fun. It's I think slightly less heavyweight than some of the other books, but I certainly enjoyed it more than I remember the first time. Count Zero by William Gibson. I finished this today, actually. This was fun. This is the second of the Neuromancer Sprawl trilogy, and there's some short stories too in that. And it's an indirect sequel. By that I mean it's not like, the witches are back. It's more like, the witches versus the guards in Discworld, in that it's, but with a bit of added impact, that there's stuff that that you get told about from the first book and what's happened from the first book. Stuff to do with the Tessia Ashpool case, that and the way that's working out in the Sprawl. When the mass biolabs and Hasaka Zaibatsus fight it out for world domination, computer cowboys like Turner and Count Zero are just foot soldiers in the great game, useful but ultimately expendable. When Turner wakes up in Mexico in a new body with a beautiful woman beside him, his corporate masters let him recuperate for a while, then reactivate his memory for a mission even more dangerous than the one that nearly killed him. The head designer from Mars Biolabs says he wants to defect to Hasaka, and it's Turner's job to deliver him safely. Count Zero is a rust-belt data hustler, totally unprepared for what comes his way when the designer's defection triggers a war in cyberspace. With voodoo gods in the net and angels in the software, he can only hope that the megacorps and the super-rich have their virtual hands too full to notice the amateur hacker with the black market kit trying desperately to stay alive. That's an only partially accurate blurb, but it's fundamentally accurate. There is a third main character, Marley Krushkova, who is an art dealer or former gallery owner and runner in Paris. She starts in Brussels, I think, doesn't she? Someone correct me, it slips my mind. But yes, who isn't anymore, but gets hired by a bajillionaire called Virek, who is basically lives virtually because his very sick body is in a vat in Sweden, being kept alive. So Virek hires her to look into some art. You're the expert in art. Look into this art and we'll see what happens. And then you've got Turner, who is on this job to get Mitchell out from the Mars Biolabs Mesa in the southwest United States. And then there's Count Zero, Bobby Newmark, who is trying to get into hacking, basically. That is the three main characters. And because it's a kind of intrigue and action story, you can't say much more about the plot without kind of starting to say, yes, and then it turned out Bruce Willis was a ghost. But it's got a plot where, you can see how things are connected, the different plots, how they affect each other, how different characters come into them. You get a large supporting cast of lots of different other people you meet. You get some good set pieces. You get some quite effective moments. It's a fun novel. I really enjoyed it. I think it's a funny one. It has a problem, I suppose. It's here for those who know that it's a bit like, it is not as good as Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons, but it's a bit like how Fall of Hyperion is like a normal book compared to Hyperion, which is this weird multi-point of view Canterbury Tales thing where you don't really know what's happening and you're trying to piece together these different stories and their different subgenres. And then Fall of Hyperion is just a normal sci-fi book, albeit a genuinely great one. This is not all-time great when Neuromancer is, but it also has that problem, we'll say, where essentially it is a more normal story, albeit with some ambitious plot things going on, like the way it does its plot. Where Neuromancer becomes increasingly transcendent. It becomes very unusual and peculiar. And this doesn't so much. And there's also some structural issues, basically to do with the pacing at the back end. It's over 300 pages. It's not a short book, but it definitely kind of ends up just thinking, he wants to end it. Gibson's like, this story is finished. I would like to finish writing this. That's the end. And it means a few things get roped together and the ending happens. And it's a fun ending. I enjoyed it, but it is pretty sudden and pretty rapidly described the key events that matter at the end. And it means you don't get payoff on everything. You get a pretty good, the functional epilogue chapter is a very fun, enjoyable payoff, I should say. And it's good at kind of dealing with different tones and notes of what's gone before and kind of resolving them. But not everything is, and you kind of realise there's some degree of like, okay, we're not going to find out that. Maybe some of it will come up in Mona Lisa Overdrive, the third in the trilogy, some of the downstream impact. But yeah, so there's some structural issues. It suffers in a sense from being much more normal, but it is very good. And I certainly enjoyed reading it, and it was fairly easy and quick to read as well. Soldier of the Mist, finally, by Gene Wolfe. This was written in the 80s after Book of the New Sun. I think possibly before he wrote Earth of the New Sun, which is the direct sequel to Book of the New Sun. And he basically wrote two of them at that point and one over a decade later. Someone can tell me exactly, but like a decade later. So these are 86. They're before Earth of the New Sun. They're before his urban fantasy story, like one-offs and his one-off detective story. They're before Book of the Long Sun. And a relevant thing there for Wolfe people is that means that his style is more expansive. It's much more like his earlier work stylistically, writing-wise, than like his later work in most respects. It has some similarities in terms of voice and the way the voice works in some ways to Book of the Long Sun, I should say. It's first person rather than third person. Is this guy Latro, and he can't remember stuff. More or less his memory, he has a 24-hour memory and his memory fades. What happened last night, he wakes up, he kind of remembers a little bit of, and then it fades away. Because we learn very early on he's had some kind of accident. And a big upshot of this, it seems, is that he can see the Greek gods, and he is a kind of agent of the supernatural, / he has to interact with the supernatural after the Battle of Plataea. Is that 479 Plataea? The Greeks defeating the Persians. And he goes over Greece and he does a bunch of stuff, and he meets a bunch of people, and there's kind of, there's a supporting cast. There's a young girl who goes with him. He makes a couple of friends, including Pindaros, a poet, which was fun. It's good. It's good fun. Basically, is the point to make at that level. It's not that hard to read. People say it's a hard Wolfe to read. I'm not sure it is. I think it's an easy Wolfe to read. I think there are one or two central mysteries which are as difficult and confusing as anything in Wolfe, in my experience. But that's not a kind of feature of the writing. So some Wolfe books you read and you're like, okay, what's going on? Here, you're able to be like, oh, that's fun. But you pick up, oh, that seems weird. I don't really understand that over time. I'd say it's not a super, super hard Wolfe book at the reading level. It's written nicely. It's interesting to see him. He's had this very intentionally Baroque and weird style in Book of the New Sun. Here, the main writing style is much less confrontational than in Book of the New Sun. It's got some very nice lines in it. Very beautiful lines, reminiscent of some of his writing in Fifth Head of Cerberus or Peace. But the big device actually that is still, and I've talked about this in Lupine Genomics, my series on his style, alienation and confusing the reader in a distancing the author, not confusing, removing your normal pegs for thinking this is this kind of book, is that it's in Greece, and sometimes we hear about Greece and the Greeks and stuff, or the Hellenes, and we hear sometimes names of Greek places, but usually we hear Greek names translated into Latro's language as, you know, as a full name. So Thermopylae, for instance, is called the Hot Gates. That is what Thermopylae means. Think about it, thermos. And Latro writes it down as the Hot Gates when he needs to talk about it. And that's an easier one, but Athens, for instance, is thought, and Sparta is rope from Spart. But that's not actually probably the real etymology of Sparta, but that's what he puts down. The same with Lacedaemonia is the silent country, and so on and so forth. Euboea is Good Cattle Island, Boeotia is Cowland, Thebes is Hill, and there's though names typically, human names are in, well, Greek typically, or are very occasionally Persian or whatever, or other languages. Divine names don't, nearly always divine names are epithets, or whether, so Pluto is the receiver of many, Hades is the receiver of many, or they are a kind of translation of a name, of a Greek name, of a personal name of a god. So you have this sort of distancing effect, which is not hard to read. You need to read it as if it's a fantasy. Here is this is something we're talking about in our buddy read on Guy Gavriel Kay's Lions of Arasan, Matthew. I buddy read this with friend of the channel Matthew, and it's something where GGK writes a recognisable history that is in a fantasy world. Here's a fantasy world, but actually this is based on medieval Spain. It's based on El Cid. It's based on, you can play this in Age of Empires 2, by the way. It's based on the Age of Empires 2 El Cid campaign is what I'm saying. I'm not sure that's the right timeline. But yeah, it's that. And you can see, this translates to this, and this religion is Judaism, and this religion is Islam. And some of these issues, therefore, are very, you can see he's translating the history and the philosophy and the ideas, adding in fantasy elements and kind of thinking and talking through the historic plot that way. You can look at David Drake taking that and turning it into sci-fi. He reading about the Anabasis and turning that into sci-fi, for instance, he did that. And here you actually have the opposite. You have Wolfe turning actual history in terms of the historical location, not Latro himself, but actual history into fantasy functioning by changing all the names, by making it as if he's a foreigner, seemingly. He doesn't speak Greek as his first language, though he knows Greek. He's been a mercenary serving the great king, the Persian emperor. He's now just with some Greeks, has this memory loss problem, can see the gods, talk to the gods. So you turn the actual our landscape of Earth into a fantasy land, and that's very different and very interesting. I think it benefits from strong and positive characters. Latro is likable. He's nice. This is not always the case with Wolfian characters, which sometimes bothers or upsets people when they don't get why a protagonist has flaws. But say in The Wizard Knight, you have a character who is immature and difficult, going in a process of maturing. And in Book of the New Sun, you have a guy who is certainly selfish and immature, and a victim of abuse who is similarly going on a process of redemption, which is parallel to the redemption of the Earth. Both of those have very clear flawed protagonists. Others have even more flawed protagonists, suffice to say. Here, Latro in Soldier of the Mist basically comes across pretty well. You quite like him. He's caught up in all kinds of crazy events with people who are basically not very nice. There's some people who are very nice. But you can enjoy being with him. You can enjoy him, and you can respect him, and you can enjoy this mythical landscape. I really like Soldier of the Mist. It was one of my books of the year so far, I think, and I'll be reading Soldier of Arete, hopefully, sooner rather than later, probably this year. Anyway, if you've read any of these, Soldier of the Mist, Count Zero, or Lords and Ladies, I'd love to hear what you think. Tell me in the comments, and I'll see you next time.